Beyond 3D.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Beyond 3D, coming to you live from the Mornington Peninsula studios of RWP 98.7. Matt and Clint here. Hopefully everyone's hanging in out there. Clint, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Matt.
Excellent.
Considering the way the world is at the moment.
Oh, man.
Can I just say congratulations to Taiwan?
Taiwan?
Yes. They've officially outlawed the consumption of dog and cat meat.
Wow.
So congratulations to them for that.
Good for them, indeed.
Just in time for the International Dog Eating Day.
Oh, there you go. I'll tell you what. Well, every dog has his day, and we're about to get ours because what's going on worldwide has been very interesting this past week. First, we've had a situation where Senor Orange decided to drop a bomb on Syria, and everybody's now saying that was an alleged false flag because the rebels actually had the chemical gases stored there. I believe it's about trying to get attention taken off the fact that there is still an FBI investigation going on to that administration. And then
there's a massive FBI investigation going on with Trump.
Well, they're talking about the fact that there could be arrests coming up in the next 2 weeks in some parts of his administration. But I think the main thing I saw this week that bugged me was the fact that they just dropped Moab, the mother of all bombs, on the Afghani-Pakistan border.
Can I play devil's advocate here for 1 second? Mm-hmm. When there is a very close pending impeachment coming up, why not go to war?
Well, the question that I found was very pertinent was the fact that a person asked, why are there so many generals in this man's administration in the cabinet?
Yeah, you know the answer to that.
Yeah, war.
Yeah,
that's what generals do.
Why would you not fill your cabinet up when that's the mission at the end of the day?
It's been a hectic week, and I think a lot of people, especially on our Facebook page, it's been quite negative. So what we're going to try to do is just get into that and play something for you where you will be able to hear exactly what is going on governmentally, militarily, and I think it's very important. So you guys are going to have something really good to listen to this week.
This clip, Matt, I would like to play is Dr. Stephen Greer. Mm-hmm. We have advocated very heavily his work over the last 3 years on this show.
We have.
This is Dr. Stephen Greer, who recently came out and wanted to talk about not just the interdimensional aspect of alien visitation, but what a true false flag is, and that the military-industrial complex has the ability to deceive the entire population it was designed to protect.
There you go. Interesting.
And with war in Korea at the moment pending, why not drop a couple of false flags?
Absolutely. Suits the purpose. Well, guys, in case you didn't know, well, by now you would know, but Moab, mother of all bombs, was dropped. This is 21,500 pounds. You have to put it up in a cargo plane to get this thing to its target. It's absolutely massive. The largest thing outside, the largest non-nuclear bomb that you could possibly drop. And I just have to ask myself, why would the current administration want to do something like this? Yes, they said they were fighting ISIS, but come on.
If it's the mother of all bombs, and it's not nuclear, it would be to eradicate everything, pretty much, but with having no fallout across the West.
Across that area. So we'll see what goes on with this. It's gonna get nasty soon coming up, and it's just a shame.
You know who predicted this?
Go ahead.
Nostradamus. Nostradamus predicted this with one of his what would you call it that he'd go into? A quatrain.
Yeah, you're right.
He said, the false trumpet concealing madness will cause Byzantium to change its laws. From Egypt, there will go forth a man who wants the edict withdrawn, changing money and standards. The trumpet shakes with great discord, an agreement broken, lifting the face to heaven. The bloody mouth will swim with blood. The face anointed with milk and honey lies on the ground.
Now I'm going to have to take that and do a little bit of research on it to see exactly what's going on.
The false trumpet.
Yeah, exactly. How about that?
There you go.
How about that?
Do you ever listen to this clip?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm going to treat everybody with this tonight. Have an open mind. Listen to what he's got to say.
Right.
And don't be fooled again.
Very important.
Beyond 3D.
Folks, want to thank all of you for coming and supporting this event. This presentation is a follow-on to what I presented about a year ago in Washington on the deep national security state and the UFO and extraterrestrial issue. What I want to share tonight is personally very difficult, and the reason it is that this issue and this presentation will be the most difficult one I've done in 26 years. It will be very controversial. It's bad news. So this is very, very bad news. And I'm not saying that to be at all melodramatic. I'm telling you what the truth is. And the only reason I'm doing this is that there have been information coming in, pinging my system, indicating that we're getting closer to the hoaxing of events to stampede the world into something that would make 9/11 look like a picnic. And there are a number of signs that have been mounting on this issue over the last 6 to 9 months. And I'm gravely concerned about it. So for that reason, without being able to say that anything is imminent, because if we can do what we should tonight and get the word out about this to the incoming Director of Central Intelligence, to people in the Kremlin, to people all over the world, there's a chance we can avoid what I'm going to be discussing. My goal here is to avoid the attack. And in this case, it would not be a medical emergency. It would be a national security and global emergency orchestrated by people who have been planning this since the 1950s. So what I'm going to be discussing is what in the parlance of the Pentagon, the CIA, counterintelligence programs is known as a false INW. Pop culture called false flag, or a deceptive INW, or indication and warning. Some years ago, I had a meeting with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and General Patrick Hughes, and the focus of that briefing, which was quite extensive, was to give him information so that he would not be deceived in the event of a false or deceptive INW, indication and warning, dealing with the UFO and ET issue. As it turned out, the general had no knowledge of either the UFO issue, the extraterrestrial issue, or the fact that there was already afoot, planned since the 1950s, a program, a longitudinal, long-term, multi-generational program to hoax a threat from outer space when there was none, or is none. This was something that the general was very concerned about, because prior to the meeting I'd sent a briefing through courier to the general. He's a 3-star, and he was unaware of any of these issues, and he sort of mirrored what he said, almost word for word, what the first director of the CIA that I briefed in 1993 said, and that is, I have made inquiries into this issue, but I have been provided no information. And at that point, he goes over to a bookshelf in the meeting room for the general, which is in the E-ring of the Pentagon, picks up a doll, a little ET doll, looks like one of those little things you get at a toy store. And he held it up, and he was, with great anger, said, "This is all I have gotten for my inquiries on the UFO issue." And it was, of course, people making fun of him. And I said, yes, that's typical. However, there are people on your senior staff who are permanently assigned to this directorate, to being the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, whereas the director rotates, just like the CIA director rotates. And they know about it, but they're not telling you because they want to keep you in the dark. At that instant, a full bird colonel who was at the briefing stiffened visibly and became quite agitated, but remained silent. And my military advisor and I afterwards compared notes and said, that man is the gatekeeper, deceiving the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now that little vignette, multiply it all throughout the dysfunction of governments around the world. And so you have people who often, you would think, who would have knowledge of these issues. And it turns out they do not. And then there are other people who should have nothing to do with something this sensitive who are running the projects outside constitutional oversight of the president, the Congress, and their appointees, and of we, the people, most importantly. This is why Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first CIA director when it was formed in 1947, took the place of the OSS, said in a letter that the secrecy surrounding UFOs was a threat to the national security. This is why Eisenhower said the secrecy, unwarranted secrecy is what he said, it could be a threat to our democracy and our way of life. And they were referring to this dynamic. So what we have to do as the people, and I'm a citizen, I mean, contrary to rumors, I don't do anything except pro bono free briefings for people in government when they ask me because they found out, oops, this stuff is true, who can I go to and find out what's really going on? And I'll be called into a briefing. But the problem is, in that vacuum of secrecy, extreme, illegal, unacknowledged special access projects, which is what they're called, at a compartmented level, at least 21 levels, compartments, past the level of the president, 21 levels, that you have a permanent infrastructure that has evolved or spun off from the legitimate government, but that is embedded within the corporate sector, the intelligence community, and the military sector, that is run amok viciously of our liberties and our freedoms, and have therefore been given no oversight or restraints so that they could set up a dynamic where they could hoax an alien attack on planet Earth. Now, this is going to be very complicated, and it's going to be the most complex presentation I've ever done. It's going to be intellectually dense. Now, I want to be really clear that when this I'm sharing is, I would not do it if I didn't think it could be avoided. I would just keep my mouth shut and retire. So in 1994, by that date, I had learned that there was a sub rosa, deep national security state operation that had completely gotten out of control so badly that when I brought this up to the general who was in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes, he said, yes, my father in the 60s knew of such a thing that had happened. We all thought he was a kook. We didn't believe him. He says, it wasn't until I got into this command as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is almost as big as the CIA, maybe bigger. That's the Pentagon shop for intelligence versus CIA civilian. And he said to me that that his father eventually committed suicide over this issue. So, very heavy. I mean, this is 10 minutes into the briefing, this 3-star general sharing this intimate and devastating fact. And I said, well, I can understand that. And he said to me, he says, how have you stayed in this game? I said, I put my vision on the far horizon. And the far horizon is that we're going to make it through this in fits and starts, and we're going to have a new civilization begin on this planet, the hallmark of which is a peaceful planet on Earth, living peacefully with these other planets. Now, to get from where we are now, which is at criticality, we could call it medically, to get from criticality now to that point is going to be a very heavy lift. But he said to me, he said, well, I'm glad you have that hope, because otherwise I don't know how you haven't eaten your gun. That's what he said. I said, well, it's not my style anyway. But I said, but the point is that there's no point in despairing, because what I have seen is a future where these issues have resolved. We have a peaceful civilization here. There's free energy running the planet. There's anti-gravity systems, so we move above the surface and don't need surface roads. Poverty is ended. There is complete economic and social justice in the world, and a sustainable, clean planet that becomes a level 1, as Michikaku would say, planet that can go forward and go into space peacefully. That's what I see happening. And within my lifetime, and I'm kind of an old guy now, so when I started this project, I was 34, and I'm 61. So I point out to people this has been, a 26, 27-year period of work, and it pulled me out of my work as an emergency doctor because I realized that we were in a global emergency.
Beyond 3.
But the cosmic false flag that I want to talk about is the crown jewel of the secrecy that was hatched in the 50s that led to Eisenhower losing control of these programs. And no president since that time has had full operational access control. They've had knowledge, but not control over these rogue elements. So now we're 60 years into a period where these operations have run amok, so much so that it has become an existential threat to life on Earth. And this is something we have to understand what the modus operandi is. What are the means for achieving this goal? And I was asked today by a gentleman I was meeting with, he says, when do you think they might do this? I say they began in 1950-something. It's already happened. It's already happened. The false flag has already happened. Now, not the crescendo moment, not the final act, all right? But acts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever, have already transpired. What do I mean by that? What I mean is these operations figured out that the psychological warfare value of this subject was such that they could set up events that are completely hoax, beginning in the 50s and 60s, that would convince people that those events were of extraterrestrial origin, alien, when they were not. And so blur the lines between the actual ET activity and the human stagecraft, as it's called, that most people, including people at the White House, wouldn't know the difference. No one in government I know, for the most part, has a clue. Even mid-level people, functionaries within the Majority Intelligence Committee, MAJIC, M-A-J-I-C, that runs these operations do not know about this. Okay, Majestic, it's MAJIC, M-A-J, okay, the Majority Intelligence Committee, M-A-J-I-C. That's on the NRO document. That's the first document that's in the brief that went to Obama via Podesta, the campaign chairman for Hillary, or the former presidential candidate Hillary, and also to Mr. Trump this past summer. So these false flag operations, and I do like the term deceptive indication and warning, very military, very precise. You ever heard of something called the Vietnam War? How many people heard of Vietnam War? And during that period, though, they hoaxed an event or exaggerated an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the Gulf of Tonkin, basically what we did, we hoaxed and exaggerated the attack on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, there near Vietnam, so that it would cause outrage in the public, outrage in Congress, and it stampeded President Johnson into vastly expanding our presence in Vietnam, which of course enriched, guess who? The military, industrial, financial, gang-bankster complex. Trillions of dollars are at stake here on a misadventure that was completely based on a hoaxed or an exaggerated event. You ever heard of something called 9/11? Well, when 9/11 happened, I don't want to go too far into this, except to say I have a gentleman who was the third highest ranking man at the Naval Research Labs, who prior to 9/11, in the Vice President's office, Vice President Cheney's, saw the plans for 9/11 prior to it occurring. He's deceased, since I'm talking about it now. I did not talk about it for years. And he was told, I used to stay at my home. He said, look, I was told my wife and my children, my grandchildren would be killed along with me if I ever mentioned this. He took it to his grave, gave me the information. God bless him, Rick Foch, who was a very high-ranking scientist, an aerospace figure in the Naval Research Labs, which is the biggest Department of Defense lab. So when 9/11 happened, which was about 4 or 5 months after the 2001 disclosure event, where we had hundreds of thousands of people contacting Congress to hold hearings on this issue, which, of course, when 9/11 happened, that fell way to the back burner very quickly. And they then said, well, we got to go get those guys in Afghanistan. Then they did something else, another false flag. They concocted false intelligence, yellow cake, remember the story yellow cake, uranium out of Africa. They made up all these stories. And they put poor Colin Powell up before the UN holding a vial of anthrax and other biological and chemical weapons, saying that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had these. He did not. And he was put up there thinking that he was being provided accurate intelligence when he was not. And there are people on the inside who have come forward saying that they knew that that intelligence was wrong or very likely wrong. But based on that, we went into Iraq, where we are still embroiled, blew up that whole area of the world. Now we have ISIS. And this was all planned and known with malice aforethought. So we don't have to reach back thousands of years with Trojan horses and machinations of Machiavellian psychopaths who have been militarists in the course of human history. We only need gaze back from Vietnam to today to see the extent to which these false flag operations, hoaxed events, exaggerated threats can stampede a populace and the Congress and the presidency into very dangerous and bad decisions. Now, the mother lode, the sort of the crown jewel of that kind of event is what has been planned assiduously since the 1950s, and that is a threat from outer space that is alien, that would unite the world around a military junta, a militarism, that would put all of humanity together, but against one or more extraterrestrial races. Now that plan, which they came up with in the 1950s, has been very carefully rolled out. And as you know from my friend Carol Rosin, who was Werner von Braun, the man who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, the V-2 rocket, and who then was brought in under Operation Paperclip by the OSS into our intelligence community and into our aerospace program after World War II. She said that on his deathbed, he said, look, first they had this plan. There would be the Cold War, and we could have had peace with the Soviet Union. Then there would be nations of concern and global terrorism. This we put out prior to 9/11, by the way. Then they would pull out the big one, and that is the threat from outer space. And it's all a lie. And that's what he kept saying, it's all a lie. And now when Carol Rosin first told me that, I said, yes, I know that. She said, you know about this already? I said, yes, I learned about this in 1993 and 1994. And she said, well, what are we going to do? I said, well, what can we do? We have to expose it. We have to expose the big lie. And it was very interesting because everyone thought, well, we're going to learn that lesson in Vietnam. We forgot it. And we had Iraq. We forgot it. So they let a certain amount of time goes by, the population becomes complacent, we have a very short-term memory on such things, and then they move another one forward. The reason this one is the big one, that has been very well planned, and what I'm going to share tonight is going to ruin some very big plans if it's taken seriously. So what I'm telling you is extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, this is, if you were to rank this on a scale of 1 to 10, of sensitive, compartmented intelligence, information, this is as high as it goes, 10. Now, I've had it confirmed, and it's going to be in our movie Unacknowledged. One of the people that's going to be in this movie is an Air Force Office of Special Investigations counterintelligence officer who confirms the false flag. Name, rank, serial number. Confirms the military's involvement in staging the abductions of humans, making it look alien. And that's not the only data point we have. The key thing to understand here, I'm discussing all of this because I don't know how much time we have, but this needs to get out now. And it's rolling down the track. This plan is on track.
Beyond 3 D.
When they began to discover, and I want to put this into three categories. You have assets that are material, stagecraft, and let's call these advanced aircraft of man-made origin. Man-made, anti-gravity, going all the way back to the late 50s and 60s. Triangular, disc, boomerang, etc. Now, what you need to understand is the gentleman I refer to and other people have confirmed this time period to me, that around October 1954, we attained gravity control. So gravity control meaning electromagnetic systems that affect an object so it becomes seemingly weightless, levitates, and corrects for gravity. Now, that research actually began with T. Townsend Brown and others in the 20s, if you look into this. And the Koloski-Frost experiment in Germany and others were using very high voltage, high frequency systems at certain hertz, cycles per second, that would cause a change in the atomic structure and the magnetic field in such a way that you could essentially cancel mass. Okay, so without boring people with a physics lesson, if you make something close to massless, no weight, but weight is different from mass, massless, then you can accelerate it at enormous speeds with very little power. And it can go right-hand turns, go up and down, and if you can control for the interior at 1G, in other words, one gravitational field, then you can go at 100,000 miles per hour, make a right-hand turn, and your brains don't come out of your ears, which was what would happen in a jet aircraft. So that work was being done in open source and then classified projects since the late 20s. The secret weapon that we had was the atomic bomb. The secret weapon Adolf Hitler was working on was this, okay? And the so-called Nazi bell, they never got it stabilized. However, they never got it stable enough to do a lot with it. So Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, and others who'd worked at Pinatubo and these other facilities for the Germans in World War II were brought into, instead of being executed, like many Nazis were, they were brought into our intelligence community, into our aerospace community. And some of them, unfortunately, took it over from inside. So in a sense, we're living through the Fourth Reich. We defeated World War II, was the Third Reich, Nazis, but they learned to, instead of clumsily stumbling around doing it that way, they went subterranean. So the globe today is a Fourth Reichian fascist order. Now, I say this with no pleasure, and I'm not speaking hyperbole. And that is the problem. It's a very huge problem. But the secrecy around this issue has only been partial. They have been wanting a certain acculturation around UFOs and ETs for the purpose of having the public think that it could be true. They don't really know what it is. So right now, more than half the public over this longitudinal, long-term psychological propaganda warfare program launched in the 50s believe UFOs are real. They believe there's intelligent life in the universe. But that's about where the granular knowledge ends. There's not a lot of granular knowledge, detailed knowledge of what all this is. And the truth is that this area of anti-gravity, let's call it, for pop culture usage, EMGs, electromagnetic gravidics, gravity control, this became the focus of the aerospace industry and actually was reported open source in aerospace journals in the late 40s and early 50s, and then it went all black. This is a documented fact. Why did it go black? because they finally figured out how to master it, and they didn't need to have more people joining in. So they wanted to close off that discussion. So in October 1954, gravity control was mastered, and we began to build various prototypes of what the public would call UFOs. And some were made to simulate the shape, appearance, and motion of an extraterrestrial vehicle. Because what better way to confuse people than to have something that looks almost the same? Is it gold? Is it fool's gold? Is it real? Is it Memorex? Get where I'm going here? This is how the spy masters operate. And luckily for them, and unfortunately for us, with the absence of the Fourth Estate and independent science and independent oversight from the public interest, the Commonwealth, they've been able to get away with enormous deception since the 50s. So I call those the assets that are material physical craft. Now that's one category. We'll return to this. There's another category, and this is more difficult to understand, and that is electromagnetic assets. And these include electromagnetic systems that could optically, like a very advanced hologram, simulate an event. Electromagnetic systems that have been called popularly electronic warfare systems that are psychotronic and radionic that interface with consciousness and thought, and electromagnetic systems that can affect large segments of the population when targeted. Now these began to be developed quite in an advanced fashion by the 40s and 50s. And by 1956, it had been accomplished to the point of state-of-the-art. And then the other asset, the third category, is human intelligence, human assets. And these are folks who, some wittingly, some unwittingly, have been provided with a script and experiences that they honestly believe are real, but that have been programmed and are like very advanced consciousness holographic experiences, if you will, electronic hallucinations. And we'll get into this also. This gets into some issues that are going to make me very unpopular with some folks. I don't care. I mean, we don't have time for that. I don't care if you like me, love me, hate me. People got to know the truth on this. So I really don't. I'm not running for mayor of Crazy Town. I just want the truth out because we can't afford this childishness. Now, so those three categories in general are what we're going to focus on. And first, let's talk about the air forms, let's call them, material assets, that are being made by Lockheed, Martin, Skunk Works, Northrup, Grumman, my uncle's old company, Boeing, Phantom Works, etc. And I have many people who have worked in these aerospace programs, also at EG&G, the Nellis Range, so-called Area 51's up the road. It's an old facility, but we'll talk about which facilities are key. But those military and corporate contractors have always had compartmented operations dealing with this, going back to after World War II. Now, some of the material that was being done by the Nazis with the so-called Nazi Bell that was anti-gravity, but it was not well controlled, and they hadn't developed it well by the end of the war. We detonated the first atomic bomb first. Began to get more and more perfected, and as I mentioned, by 1954, gravity control was attained. At that point, we had a race to see how we could how many of these forms we could develop, and the research between the mid-40s and the mid-50s was augmented, assisted, or propelled forward by the reverse engineering and study in a separate compartment of so-called extraterrestrial materiel. I'm referring now to things that some of you have heard about, like certainly the Roswell crash, Kingman, Arizona event. There are others that have happened, and these objects, which were downed with electronic warfare systems, they didn't just fly in and crash in an electrical storm. That's a myth. You don't go through interstellar space and come into the atmosphere of Earth and oops, I can't navigate, and then just suddenly crash. And it happens to be right by the only atomic bomb squadron in the world in Roswell, New Mexico. That was the only 509th Bomber Squadron was the only place in the world at the time of that event. And the interstellar civilizations were worried about what is going on Earth, because when we detonated those bombs, it was picked up by them. And they came, and they're here, and they're worried, and they should be worried.
Beyond 3D.
So that's what opened up the modern era of UFO extraterrestrial activity. And this is why you need to call this what it is. There's two things here. There's UFO is a sort of a general phrase. It just means an unidentified flying object. Well, it's unidentified only to people who are not informed. They don't fly in any normal sense of the aerodynamics flying of a plane, but they are objects. So the only true part of the word UFO is O, and the rest is an obfuscation, so a blurring of the truth. But if you use that pop culture term of UFO, there are two types. Man-made ones here, interstellar extraterrestrial ones here. And you can tell the difference if you get up close enough, and if you know what you're looking for. And we'll talk about that. The ones that were being developed by these early aerospace and research efforts were then benefited by studying the extraterrestrial objects that we began to learn how to use electromagnetic scalar longitudinal systems. Now, I'm not going to get into a big physics discussion here except to say the light you're seeing here is in a wave like this, right? So you have a wavelength, and so you have all kinds of spectra, infrared, ultraviolet, visible spectra, different. A laser is coherent light, so a green laser is all the green, and it's coherently propagating. Okay? Longitudinal or scalar electromagnetic signal is actually not a wave, but a point in a line. And it actually can propagate at multiples of the speed of light, of the waveform of light. So the waveform of light is what we call the speed of light, but there's this other type. So that began to be studied also in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, began to be weaponized into systems, and by 1947 or so, they began to have, and I use this word cautiously, successful deployments of it so that it would hit an interstellar vehicle, interfere with its electronics, and have it crash. Now, I know men personally who have operated those systems up to and including recently, in the last few years, at facilities at various places around the globe. So when you begin to hear that beginning from the 40s until not that long ago, there were multiple crash retrievals of these objects, it wasn't because these interstellar civilizations they're running around with IQs of 400 to 600. They're very advanced. They were running into the deployment of these systems, and they were based all over, and they began to be based all over the planet. And by the 1960s, they had successfully propagated those around the globe in enough locations covertly that they could track and target an extraterrestrial vehicle, hit it, and have it to become disabled. Now, obviously not every ET object that appears has that happen, so it's not like it happens every nanosecond, but it has happened dozens and perhaps hundreds of times. I met with an officer in the Army who was at Fort Huachuca out here in Arizona, Army Intelligence Headquarters, who had been in an underground facility in the 70s where there were 9 extraterrestrial vehicles and autopsied bodies that were in storage there. So, and that's just one facility, and that was 40 some years ago, Fort Huachuca, Arizona. So these facilities began to be developed that are all underground, and they were studying the extraterrestrial material. That operation was very separate from the conventional, let's call it, extraordinary anti-gravity research going on in other operations. There were very few points of contact. So this is where you get into a complex understanding of TSSCI, Top Secret Special Compartmented Information or Intelligence. And the compartmentalization is very, very specific. And there could be people working on, say, gravity control systems for the Lockheed Skunk Works, but they weren't allowed to talk to and didn't know anything about the people studying the extraterrestrial materials, but there would be a few points of contact that would bridge it over, all right? But very few, very tightly compartmented. That's how that is structured. And I have had the privilege of interviewing people who've worked on both sides. Now, when you begin to consider then, we've had over 60 years, 62 years, and trillions of dollars in black budget unacknowledged special access funding, USAP, unacknowledged special access, completely black funding of this kind of research and development, both on extraterrestrial material and on other conventional, and the then augmentation of the conventional anti-gravity human with the extraterrestrial studied material, you can begin to realize that what's out there that humans control is fearsome and awesome. And unfortunately, to the lay person or to the average general, admiral, or president is indistinguishable from an extraterrestrial object in their mind. So that is really the danger point. That is where you have the risk of you being able to take these objects that are 100% man-made, 100% man-made, 100% thought it was ET. This is what I'm saying. False flags already happened, but they've been beta testing the system with these kinds of events. Another one that was reported are the big flying triangles, 200-300 feet across. So these have been reported, and they have a grid structure, very manufactured, very man-made. Silent, except for a little bit of a humming sound when you're close. Electromagnetic Gravidics, floats along. Now, here's another layer of confusion that I didn't get a chance to share this with Mr. Schrad. There are extraterrestrial objects that look like and approximate the man-made ones. Now, you want to get a little more confused. Consider that if there's an extraterrestrial event that happens, they will then put up a man-made one, and they'll hoax a man-made event piggybacking on an extraterrestrial one, just to really confuse the picture. And that's happened many, many times. And there's a plethora of these that are very strange looking. This is another one reported in a case, and these are all man-made. Now, to anyone who would casually see this, and then objects that were very similar to what was seen in the Phoenix lights, these sort of objects, fraction of a mile across, also can be, not always are, can be human man-made ones. If I'm confusing you, I apologize. But I think the nuance of this can't be lost anymore. We can't be simplistic and, frankly, stupid. So there's an entire history of aerospace research and development that's now 62 years on, using technologies that are having to do with mass cancellation, anti-gravity. And those have been deployed purposely so that it'll get into the media and thousands of people will see it, and it will either hide an extraterrestrial event and overwhelm it, or it will simply be a way of them testing the system to see what will the people say, what will the media say, how are they going to react, and then they can refine their algorithm, their protocol for how to do the hoax down the road. This is how they refine the false flag over a 60-year period. Now, one of the people who you all have heard of, I'm sure, who was the Lockheed Skunk Works head for years until he passed away, is Ben Rich. And, I have people who were at meetings with him where he confirmed that we had things that could, quote, take ET home. And he also acknowledged that every point in space and time is connected to every other one through consciousness, and that telepathy, as it's commonly called, is real, etc. But Ben Rich may not have had all full access up to that level. And in some letters that we have, I have a letter, Lockheed Advanced Aeronautics, to a gentleman, to Mr. John Andrews. He says, And so in this, the letter, he asked for a clarification. And he says, did you mean UFOs as in man-made or extraterrestrial? And Ben Rich, the head of the very famous Lockheed Skunk Works, says, Dear John, this is the July 21st, 1986. Yes, I'm a believer in both categories. Many of our man-made UFOs are unfunded opportunities. He underlined UFO and unfunded opportunities. Best regards, Ben Rich. Explosive.
Beyond 3.
Now, he, again, would not have had a complete all-access pass into every compartment, extraterrestrial and man-made, because the intelligence officer that we have recently interviewed confirmed that the area at Nellis Air Force Base that dealt with man-made advanced UFO type anti-gravity was completely separate from and hermetically sealed from the extraterrestrial facility underground that was run by people, not ETs, but that had the ET craft they were studying. We've also had it confirmed that the very famous Cash Landrum case, how many people have heard of this? In the early 80s, and there was a craft outside Houston that had a core breach and was spewing radioactive material and injured and killed a couple of women. And it looked like a saucer, and it was flying, and they had to call in helicopters to assist, and it made a crash landing in a remote area. This Air Force Office of Special Investigations official, on camera, admits that he was the principal investigator that for the Air Force put out the cover story that it was a UFO, and he said it was one of ours, but the skin of the craft, the shell, was extraterrestrial. The power plant, which they had not been able to fully figure out, had a hybrid system that had a nuclear power component that had a filtering problem and a core breach and began to spew radioactivity on people. And this is on camera. This is a lieutenant colonel, name, rank, serial number. What you need to understand is that the intelligence community is thrilled if the UFO community says it was a UFO, it was all alien, when in reality it's not that simple. It's both. Some of it's ET, some of it's man-made. Some of it's both. And the Cash Landrum crash case was both. So this understanding is key. Otherwise, everyone's going to assume anything that we don't understand that zips around is extraterrestrial. Moreover, anything that would come over and do an Independence Day attack, boom, is extraterrestrial, when it isn't. It is not. It is absolutely not. It's all a lie. It's the biggest hoax in human history, and you've got to wake up to this. So, and I think that one of the problems that we have is, and I remember in 1994, I was going to quit all this. It's too difficult. A man came to me and says, yes, you've discovered the truth. But guess what? No one's going to believe you. He says the truth is so much more bizarre than the lie that it hides itself. And he says, for that reason, you will be discredited, even though you're speaking the truth. He says, so just be prepared that if you talk about this, you will be discredited. And I said, I understand that, but do you not warn the public of something like this? If we had known that we had hoaxed the Gulf of Tonkin, and could we have avoided Vietnam? If we had known about 9/11 in advance, or the hoaxing of the weapons of mass destruction materials about Iraq, could we have avoided that disaster? This is my dilemma. So, if I speak the truth, I'm discredited and hated. If I don't speak the truth, I carry a heavy burden. So, I'd rather speak the truth even if people hate it. Now, here's another object that's been seen. Very unusual, very detailed, excellent, man-made, very advanced. I suspect would deceive almost everyone who saw it. And this is the Hudson Valley boomerang shape, probably out of the Boeing Phantom Works. And tens of thousands of people saw this, by the way. The ones who were close enough to it could see actually the structure and the girds and the struts and the infrastructure of the craft. Well, interstellar vehicles don't have that. So here's a little tip. The ET objects are seamless, have no parts like that, and have a completely different quality to them because they are interstellar and transdimensional, because they go beyond the speed of light and they are manufactured in a way that is completely different. So listen very carefully, because I'm going to blow your minds if I haven't already, but listen carefully. Your life will depend on it, and those folks in Washington and Moscow listening, listen very carefully. Interstellar vehicles do not manufacture the way we do. So like if you're going to make one of these, you're going to dig up the materials, put it through a mold, rivet it together, have plates and struts and parts, right? But it's got a power plant on it that's electromagnetic gravitic, mass cancellation, it floats, it's silent, looks and sounds like a UFO, and it could be a saucer, it could be any shape. They can make them in any shape. An interstellar vehicle is not manufactured that way. So I don't want to lose everyone with a lot of jargon here, but if you can for a moment, you've heard of 3D printing? Imagine if you did 3D printing, but from another dimension. Think about that for just a minute. So that you, if you had mastered 0-point energy, the base energy field that all matter and energy is fluxing from, all subatomic particles, and you had mastered it in such a way that you could create a resonant frequency in the shape of a spacecraft, and it would then go from that fourth, fifth dimensional energy field into 3D as almost an extrusion mold. Does this make sense? And where it would materialize in that perfect form. It wasn't something that was put together by digging up those minerals, melting them, smelting them, and riveting them together. This is why they do not have those kind of moving parts and seams. They are seamless. Very important data point for those of you who will have a close encounter with a man-made object versus a close encounter with an extraterrestrial object. And I'll take it one step further. When they have retrieved extraterrestrial objects and they've done the assays, the metallurgical studies and atomic studies, the material is so pure that even in the vacuum of space, we could not create it with any known human technologies, because it's being created transdimensionally using these sort of electronic fields that cause matter to be aggregated, if you will, out of thin air, out of space. Now we're talking about something which the guys I know at the CIA call WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic. That is what they call it. Now, my uncle worked for Northrup Grumman on the lunar module, landed on the moon, and I talked to an engineer there not long ago, and he said, yes, we just call it PFM, and excuse my language, pure magic. And he says that's what they call it. He was an aerospace engineer. And so when you begin to deal with these sort of very advanced technologies, there are grades of it. So there's man-made anti-grav, there's man-made anti-gravity systems that have been hybridized, studying extraterrestrial materials, the notch up. Then you have the purely extraterrestrial objects, which are a quantum leap beyond. Now, since Ben Rich died in 1995, and he made those comments, in the last 21 years, trillions of dollars have been spent on this. And some of the most brilliant minds in the world have worked on it. Some of these gentlemen I know, scientists, and they worked in the Cube, as it's called, up there at the Skunk Works underground, not far from Palmdale. And in the Cube, they've done things that are now transdimensional. So now they have the ability to hoax events that really, even more so, look extraterrestrial, but are man-made. Very dangerous business. Now, this is why the President-elect and the Congress and the National Military Command Center and the Director of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense and the generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, most of whom will never be read into what I'm sharing, need to know this. They have a need to know. And so do you, the public, so you're not fooled. Don't be fooled again. And Mr. Putin needs to know this, because there is a group that has malice aforethought and has planned to launch these assets in a way that would look like 100% like an attack on our planet or on human assets, calling it alien when it's being run by people. But it's very sophisticated, and we should not underestimate their capacity.
Beyond 3 D.
Back some years ago, I hosted in Washington, prior to the National Press Club event in 2001, a private briefing for Congress that was at the Westin Hotel in Georgetown. And there were a number of people there and chairmen of committees. And Edgar Mitchell was there as my guest. He's passed on now. And one of the gentlemen who was there was a man who had been on an interagency committee in 1974. Now, this is 42 years ago. And the testimony he was going to provide to those members of Congress and other people. There was a science advisor for Vice President Al Gore there, all kinds of folks, was that we had this capability I'm telling you about today in November of 2016, and that all they would have to do is push a button, boom, and the entire event would roll out. And he said everyone on planet Earth would be fooled. Now, if I had heard that only from one person, I would have discounted it as madness. I've heard it from one person after another, after another, after another, after another, on a granular level. And now we have an Air Force Office of Special Investigations counterintelligence officer confirming the false flag operations. But he would not discuss, he says, that's still very secret. That's very secret. I can't talk about that. Because I asked the question in a way that he understood. Do you know about the deceptive INWs and the false INWs? Now, what happens then when you have a black operation that is so secretive that they could pull off a stunt like this? It means they could stampede the entire world into an Independence Day, like the movie, event. Has this already been beta tested? Yes. So they beta tested and have been testing on the public sightings that are man-made UFOs, often piggybacking on sightings of actual ET craft, so that people are confused, don't have any discernment. So there have been abduction squads, which are also confirmed by this Air Force intelligence officer, that have been operative for decades. And when it has suited the intelligence community, they have engaged in human abductions that 100% fool those poor victims who really think they were abducted by an ET. And they weren't, but it sure looks like it. Now, there are two modalities used here. The aircraft itself, which is an anti-grav. The stagecraft initially were special operations personnel who now they have robotic ones that look actually like certain species of ETs, extraterrestrial biological entities in the EBINs. But they're man-made. I know several people who worked on making these creatures, and they've been called programmed life forms, but they have integrated circuits in their neural complex. They're 100% man-made, but but they would absolutely fool 99.999999 to out to 100 decimal points anyone in the public that it was extraterrestrial. Those are fully operational, have been for decades. It's also done in association with electromagnetic weapon systems that alter awareness, can make you black out. A lot of people have said, oh, Dr. Greer says no one's ever been abducted. I said, they have. And they attempted to abduct me out of my hotel room at the St. Moritz Hotel in July of 1994 when I met with Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein. So I'm one of those victims. I know what they're capable of. The difference with me is that I knew what it was. Now this gets more complex, and we haven't scratched the surface. And I don't know how disturbed you are yet, but it's going to get worse. Take a deep breath. So in 1989, there was a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, head of the Soviet Union, and then during that period of the Bush era, President Bush, George H.W. Elder, who had been CIA director. And he was a mid-level person on this MAJIC committee, Majority Intelligence Committee, or Majestic. And he and Gorbachev and Perez de Cuellar, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations, and others were planning to disclose that we weren't alone in a disclosure event. In November of 1989, Perez de Cuellar was abducted out of his motorcade at about 3 a.m. in New York City by aliens. Now, I put in parentheses aliens, meaning human assets. And he was taken and on board this human-controlled abduction event and told that if he were to continue with that plan, that the aliens would abduct everyone involved, including the President of the United States. And Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein told me this personally because he was personal friends with Perez de Cuellar, the UN Secretary General. And the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein said to me, this is why I don't believe you'll be successful at disclosing the extraterrestrial presence. And I just smiled and I said, well, I believe you have it backwards. And he did not know, this was in July of 1994, of the ability of the intelligence community to set up a hoax of someone like a world figure, political figure like the head of the United Nations. That actually happened. Now, because of that, Gorbachev, Bush Sr., the president, Perez de Cuellar, and others involved canceled the plans to let the public know we weren't alone, because they were concerned that, and I was told, and I'm quoting by Prince Hans von Liechtenstein, that this blew up like an atomic bomb in the Bush White House, and they said, we're staying out of this now. And ever since then, no one in that office has wanted to deal with this, because they don't know what's ET and now what's human. And the stagecraft and the ability to interfere with plans by people who are congressmen or UN secretary generals or presidents is so great that none of them want to risk that happening to them. Because in those elite circles, those folks don't want that to happen to them. Or worse. This is why, when I got this information to President Bill Clinton via his CIA director, 2 months or a month later, his very good friend of the Clinton family came to my home and said, well, they really support what you're recommending, but they're afraid that if President Clinton does this, he will end up like Jack Kennedy. And I laughed. I thought he was joking. And he says, what are you laughing at? I'm being serious. And I said, well, if that's true, we really are in trouble. Now, that was in January 1994. And you can see why between December of 1993 and the summer of 1994, I was canceling my involvement in this subject. I had to be begged to stay in it. Who do I share this with, and when, and what detail? I am only scratching the surface. And because of what has been happening with the WikiLeaks, with John Podesta's emails about UFOs, the New York Times reporting on Hillary's interest in it, which this was a red line subject, The mainstream media is starting to report it. They are being unleashed. To me, there are signs out there that this false flag hoaxing of an attack on the planet is closer than it's been in 22 years that I've been involved. Now, the gentleman who had this story to tell and who was an official on the interagency committee dealing with this specifically, who was going to testify in front of these members of Congress at that private meeting I set up in 1997, he told me that this was the most difficult thing he'd ever done because he felt like he was betraying some of his brothers in the intelligence community, but he felt the world needed to know. That night, he was sequestered out of the West End Hotel by people who he had worked with back in the 70s and taken to an undisclosed location out in Virginia, and he never returned, and we've never heard from him since. He left a note under my assistant's door, Sherry Adamak, saying that I have to leave. The people who I've worked with are begging me not to go forward with this testimony, and they are begging for time for them to get this under control and stand it down. Unfortunately, I do not think he succeeded. I think these rogue elements have prevailed since 1997. It's almost 20 years later. And for that reason, we are in mortal danger of being deceived by this.
Beyond 3 D.
Now, am I saying that all people who have had contact with ETs have been abducted by humans? No. I'm saying, though, that if you have trillions of dollars and the kind of technologies I've been referring to, and you have the intent to masquerade and simulate an alien contact abduction event, you can do it. So that is one of the chief issues that we have to begin to think about. What part of what we hear about in the UFO and internet and movies and books is ET, Interstellar? What part is counterintelligence and propaganda and conditioning events by the intelligence community and by the deep, darkest parts of this rogue community that have betrayed the United States and every other country on earth? Well, I'm telling you that their stagecraft, as they call it, is so good that there are very few people who would not be deceived by it. Now, I want to talk about another level of this, and this is a more complex one than what I've shared, and that is the electromagnetic systems, human-controlled, that affect consciousness and the human experience. Back in 1994, I met a man who headed up a research and development effort in the 50s. And he had developed an electronic system so that you could put on a headset and alter anyone, not a trained psychic, but anyone, so that they could remote view through consciousness to the field of mind any place on Earth. He offered this system to me as the director of CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, because our prime mission is to create a time of universal peace and open contact. And we use remote viewing, but we use the more innate capability, meditative faculties, as you probably know. And I said, no, I don't want that, because that's going to lend itself to being misused. And he says, you're very wise. It has been misused. So after he developed it, the CIA set up a front company, I believe he called it Alphametric Corporation, that bought this technology and then took it in subterranean and has been developing it ever since. So he said, we developed this so well that we can target somebody with an electromagnetic field that has embedded in it like a script or a hologram or a series of experiences, like a lucid dream. And that person will believe it's real, and it'll be indistinguishable from reality. And I am quoting now from this senior scientist. He said, it is so good that if we want you to have a personal conversation with your personal God, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, whoever it is, you'll have it, you will think it's real, and you will absolutely pass a lie detector test that it happened. That's how good it is. Now, that was fully operational in 1956, 60 years ago. So now you combine that with the conventional stuff like MK Ultra, but the MK Ultra stands for mind control, K like German control, and it was acknowledged CIA program. It came out during the Senator Church hearings back some years ago in the 70s, I believe. And they were using, what they acknowledged through those hearings was they were using LSD and other things to do mind control. The part of it that did not get acknowledged in the church hearings on Capitol Hill is what I'm discussing now. That was kept secret. And that's the electromagnetic systems. Some people call these radionic and psychotronic systems that can affect consciousness. They can also affect biological systems. They can induce cancers. They can induce heart attacks. They can do a lot of nasty stuff with these weapons. And they have. So now you combine this with chemical hallucinogenic systems, electromagnetic mind-altering targeting systems, the stagecraft or programmed life forms, or small people who are made up to look like an ET, and boy, can you fool a lot of folks. So this that I'm talking about right now, I was pulled aside by someone and said, if you continue to talk about this, you are putting your life in peril. We're going to not tolerate it. Now that was in 1994 also, because this is the deepest part of the secrecy around this subject. Nobody wants to talk about it. No one wants to acknowledge it. If you do talk about it, they think you're wearing a tinfoil hat. You're going to get ridiculed, you're going to be debunked, and the UFO believers are going to hate you because they bought into certain paradigms of us versus them and all this stuff that's in the pop culture and internet and movies and documentaries, and it's all a hoax. And the intelligence community is going to hate you. The public can't get their mind around it. It's a lose-lose-lose situation for a gentleman like myself. And but I still feel compelled that you need to know the truth. A few people need to hear this who can be prime movers and help us. We're running out of time. When I first got involved with this, I was early on invited out to Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch out in the Tetons, and unfortunately people call this the Rockefeller Initiative and this and that. What it was, and you can look this up online, it was Project Starlight. And Project Starlight I started in 1993 to put together people who would be whistleblowers and military witnesses and put the best available evidence together to get to the president and members of Congress to let them know about this. Now, Lawrence Rockefeller and I had a very private discussion on his deck that one of the nights we were all gathered out there. And I asked him, I said, we need someone like you to lead this up. I have 4 young children and I'm full-time in an emergency department taking care of life and death things 60, 80 hours a week. I really don't have time to do this. And he said, no, I won't do it. You have to do it. And I said, are you out of your mind? I'm a country doctor in North Carolina, rambling around in an ER. And I said, this is not something I should be doing. You're a Rockefeller. And I literally said, look, Lawrence, you're old, you're rich, and you're a Rockefeller. Just like that. And I'm very blunt. And but he said, no, my family, referring to David Rockefeller, his brother, who was head of Chase Manhattan Bank, who's part of this cabal, and his nephew, Jay Rockefeller, who was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, also a member of the cabal, are jumping up and down on my nuts. And I said, well, I'm sorry about that, but blood's thicker than water. And he wouldn't do it. So he's played a support role, and we began to organize this effort. And in 1995, we had the Asilomar gatherings near Monterey, where we had KGB people, cosmonauts, military witnesses come together. We signed, many of us, not everyone, the Project Starlight document that went to the president. The Associated Press sued. It got released. It's on the website. Go see it. This is all a matter of public record. But what Lawrence Rockefeller said to me is that not only was his family upset, but it was too dangerous for him to do. And he begged me to just go ahead and do it. But in these sort of corridors, there are a lot of very good people who really do want to see this resolved, but they don't know what to do about it. And I've concluded it cannot be resolved by these elites. It's got to be resolved by us. We've got to get educated about this. We need more whistleblowers to step forward confirming this information, like this Air Force intelligence officer who did an astonishing 3.5-hour interview. At the same time, we need to understand that if we can put out a warning call, all of you listening, to our friends, our neighbors, we can perhaps avert this disaster. And because putting the sunshine on this and exposing it neutralizes the threat. There's no element of surprise if we come out with information, and more people do, like Mr. Schratt, showing what these aircraft that men are making at the Skunk Works and at Northrup and at Boeing are, and what their capabilities are. But we also need more people like these whistleblowers. Now, there's a whole group of people who have been exposing electronic warfare systems. Here we have an NSA veteran, Naval Academy graduate, a practicing physician who is targeted with these weapons, a whistleblower from DARPA, U.S. Army officer in physics, a whole group of people I have here who have come forward with these electromagnetic weapon systems and how innocent people have been victimized, targeted by them. And being one of those people, and I've been someone who has been targeted with these systems, I can tell you that if you know they exist, you won't be fooled by them. If you don't know they exist, you will. This is why, in the Vedas it says knowledge is the greatest purifier. If we have knowledge, then we can discern. If we have no knowledge and no information and we're in the dark, we can be deceived.
Beyond 3D.
But this information's been out for decades, but it's sort of hidden in plain sight. What I want to do is connect these dots to folks so that you understand that, yes, there are extraterrestrial civilizations. They're very concerned with what's happening on this planet. And yes, there are humans that have these assets that mimic and have reached, and I'm going to use this word carefully, parity, near equivalence with what an appearance would be of an extraterrestrial vehicle, because they have become more and more and more refined over the decades, up to and including very powerful electromagnetic systems that are transdimensional, can materialize things, if you go to Dugway Proving Grounds near Salt Lake City, near Provo, there are things going on there that look 100% ET, but they're not extraterrestrial, they're man-made. But it's incredibly well-defined, well-developed. With that knowledge, maybe we will have discernment. And with that knowledge and discernment, maybe we won't be fooled again. This is my hope and my prayer. And if we don't get discernment, we're going to be sitting ducks, much more so than we were on 9/11. And I think that this is why, in my opinion, we all have the responsibility to share this seminar and this information with the public, with everyone we know, as far-fetched as it may seem. Now, this is going to be very difficult for me to talk about. I don't like talking about personalities. You'll find that in the history of my entire career, I talk about issues and information and not people. But with that said, I want to talk about a gentleman who I knew quite well, who's passed away, named Dr. Fred Bell. And he, in the disclosure materials, one of the only a couple people who aren't named name, rank, and serial number. And I will tell you now, first time I've ever shared this, why he's not named. He shared information very important, but I had to be very careful of what I included. Now, this gets into the sort of unique responsibility I have in this regard. And he had been given over to the MK Ultra program at the agency at birth, literally at birth, to the intelligence community, to be programmed as sort of a genius in aerospace and technology, and to work inside the system as sort of a electronically, psychotronically controlled slave. Now, that's how I would put it. Now, his parents did this with knowledge and forethought. How anyone can do this to a child, I don't know. But he was. And I was at his home and saw his badges from Hughes aircraft, from the anti-gravity chamber that Hughes had, from all the different contractors and things he had worked on. And he had gotten, and actually had met Werner von Braun also. And his specialty, what they had trained him to do, was to develop weapon systems that would target, hit, and knock down extraterrestrial vehicles when they came out of trans-dimensional space time into 3D. Now, I don't want to get too techie here again, but when you're going from the Andromeda galaxy 2.5 million light years from here to Earth, you're not going at the speed of light. It'd take you 2.5 million years to get here. That's what a light year is. The distance light goes in a year. So it'd take you 5 million years to go back and forth at the speed of light. Never mind the space shuttle or some piece of junk like the rockets and jets. So if you are an interstellar civilization, you are by definition trans-dimensional, because you're going to go through the crossing point of light, you're going to cross into these other dimensions, and then in point A and point B, 2.5 million light years distance, Andromeda galaxy, Earth, then is here, because you're bypassing linear space-time. Does it make sense? And you can do this through teleportation resonance systems. Anyway, so, which, by the way, we started experimenting also with in the 50s, and were able to perfect. In fact, even before then, the so-called Philadelphia experiment, which didn't happen in Philadelphia, that's another long story, I won't get into the weeds here, was in the 40s. So these electronics were being experimented with humans, but interstellar civilizations perfected this many, many, many millions of years ago. Some of them are certainly hundreds of thousands of years ago. Now what that means is that as they then come into near Earth or materialize in our solar system, at that point they're trackable in the deep space network, out of NORAD and other facilities, and off of satellites. As they approach Earth, then they can be targeted with these electronic scalar systems and hit. And that's what's been going on for over 70 years. This is an existential threat to Earth. Now, I have personal, detailed knowledge, and so did Dr. Bell. He admitted he was involved not only in developing the technologies, but present when they were being used, actuated, and would go out and witness them. Boom, one would hit an ET craft, drop straight into the Pacific Ocean. 1965, 51 years ago. So the fact that this has been going on for 70 years or more since Roswell, and there has not been a serious pushback, an overt pushback by these interstellar civilizations, is remarkable. I doubt we would have behaved similarly. And this is why I say to people, I think you should be much less concerned about the extraterrestrial civilizations than the human. And if you want to know where the problem is, go find a mirror and look in it right now. But Dr. Bell, when he was discussing this, also would then tell me about these electronic systems that he was put through in MK Ultra, where he had experiences that were trans-dimensional in consciousness. He thought were real, with beings and civilizations that were horrific, horrible. And that's how they taught him to hate the aliens. So whenever he would, that's how they got him to be enthusiastic about the science, because he had these experiences with these aliens. It was all a scripted psychotronic hologram. And he would then say, like Will Smith in Independence, let's go kick alien butt. And he'd go out there, and when they would hit one of these ET craft and it would fall down, he would just jump up and down with joy. We killed another one of the bastards. Now, I'd sit in his home as he related these things and went, whoa, boy, this is very dangerous stuff. You're dealing with civilizations that have been visiting us on Earth for, dare I say, millions of years. Ancient aliens, anyone? But yes, I mean, we've never been alone. And suddenly we're doing atomic weapons and the nuclear weapons and these scalar weapons and all this other stuff. And they have not pushed back yet. What does that say? It's almost a Gandhi-esque restraint. You know, when Gandhi was shot by the guy who assassinated him, he turned and blessed him and fell. The last thing he did was bless the person in a Christ-like act of forgiveness. So, you know, if they were so horrific, we would have known about it about 1945. It'd have been all over, point, set, match, finished. Now, when I was at the Vatican having a theological conversation about this with Monsignor Balducci, and Monsignor Balducci was a senior theologian, actually a demonologist for the Pope John Paul. And we were talking about this. He says, oh, it's so ridiculous. He says, we all know, of course, if they were a threat, it'd all be over. And he said, and I love it, with classic Italian flourish, he said, lower than humanity, there cannot exist in the universe. And it was a very interesting perspective from this senior theologian. Now, he did say that, however, there's an attempt to confuse people with things from other dimensions that are like demons or even angels with ETs. But he says, you know what? Angels, and by inference, demons, don't need flying saucers. But people, because of the strangeness of how an interstellar civilization going through dimensions can appear, people will conflate them or confuse them with either a demon or an angel. Guess what? The intelligence community loves that you're confused. And they put things out to further confuse you. To wit, mutilations.
Beyond 3.
This is rooted in thousands of years of human experience, where one tribe would attack and rape another, one ethnicity, one religion. So whether it's homophobia, Islamophobia, religious, ethnic, racist tendencies, these have a root that go back thousands of years in human experience. And they have found that when you develop a behavior like that, epigenetically, it is passed on within a generation or two, not thousands of years. But it means, this is the good news, you can reverse it in a generation or two. We can reverse racism. We can reverse alienism. We can reverse all of these things that have divided us into warring factions. We can no longer live as a species that views anything that we don't understand or is different from us as a priori immediately a threat and get into a fight with them. Whether it is another race, another gender, another sexual orientation, another ethnicity, or another species from another planet, because that only ends in destruction. Now, when we were just clubbing each over the head with, clubs and spears and stuff, or muskets even, it was one thing to behave this way. It was deleterious and appalling and savage. To do it with thermonuclear weapons and these other classified weapons, and then to start bamming around out in space with this consciousness of alienism and division, is fraught and very risky. So I would say that, we shall overcome this through the force of our intellect, through spiritual development, and through the realization that within the field of conscious intelligence, there's a singularity of mind, and that all life in the universe and all intelligent life is awake through that same spirit. And if we view ourselves and these other civilizations with the understanding of what the conscious mind is, as an omnipresent field that is non-local, that there is a singular singularity of consciousness and mind. As Erwin Schrödinger said, the total number of minds in the universe is one. This is the father of modern quantum physics. And we begin to experience that in our meditation, our prayers, and our spiritual consideration. The solution is, well, not simplistic, simple. It's spiritual. It's a spiritual development. But if we're now having to deal with interstellar civilizations that are waiting for us to join the Interstellar Club and the Interstellar Society, which is what's been happening for many decades, we're going to have to find a solution to this thinking, this paradigm of division, of racism and alienism that the intelligence community, the bad actors here, not the good guys, but the bad actors have been exploiting because they know there is a history of people hating and fearing and fighting anyone that is different from them. And they know that they can exploit that. And they have been exploiting it. And we have to stand up and wake up and say, no more. We won't be fooled again.
Beyond 3D. Welcome back to Beyond 3D. Matt, that was a bit of a haul.
Yeah, it was.
But it was informative.
Necessary. And I don't know, after this weekend, just watching what's been going on, I'm really amazed at how, I'm not amazed at what the administration is doing. I'm amazed at how people are trying to justify and explain away what's going on. And I'm finding myself more disappointed with those people than with the administration itself. The administration can be dealt with. The people who are trying to justify everything, it's another story, and they have a rude awakening coming. So, oh well.
And there's an end game.
Yes.
And none of us know what the end game is yet.
Oh, but we'll find out soon enough. We will find out soon enough. Anyway, guys.
That's all we've got time for this week, Matt.
That's all we can do. So thank you for listening in. We will catch you next week with another edition of Beyond 3D.
And don't forget to look up our Facebook page.
Absolutely.
It's the word Beyond, the number 3, a hyphen, and the letter D.
Catch you next week, guys. Take care.
Good night. Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.